The People's Republic of China operates the largest maritime militia force in the world. It is a force that exists in a legal category specifically designed to deny its adversaries the frameworks they would otherwise use to respond to it. The vessels are registered as civilian fishing boats. Their crews hold civilian maritime documents. They operate under the administrative authority of local fisheries bureaus, whose connection to the PLA's Southern Theater Command is documented in open-source research but not acknowledged in any official Chinese communication. When they are challenged on the radio, they respond in the language of fishermen rather than soldiers. When they are observed at close range, they look like what their registration papers say they are. And when they assemble in formation around a foreign military vessel, which they have done repeatedly in the South China Sea since at least 2012, they do so with a geometric precision and a behavioral discipline that no independent fishing fleet, responding to market forces and weather conditions and the migratory patterns of fish, has ever spontaneously produced. The USS Guided Missile Destroyer had been conducting a freedom of navigation operation in the waters of the South China Sea's Whitsun Reef area since 9:14 a.m. Whitsun Reef is a boomerang-shaped atoll whose legal status is a matter of direct contest between the Philippines, which considers it part of its exclusive economic zone under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and China, which claims historic rights over the feature and has used the regular stationing of maritime militia vessels at the reef since 2021 as a method of converting that claim from an assertion into a physical fact. The destroyer's freedom of navigation transit was a legal statement. The waters around the feature are international waters, and the United States Navy exercises transit rights in international waters. The statement had been made before. It would be made again. It required repetition, because repetition is the only form that legal continuity takes in a waterway where someone else is trying to establish continuity through physical occupation. At 9:47 a.m., the first contact appeared on the surface plot, a vessel approximately 12 nautical miles north of the destroyer's position, coming south at 9 knots. IS Broadcasting. Registered fishing vessel. Hull length consistent with a 55 to 65 meter commercial fishing platform. Designated contact Foxtrot 1. At 9:51 a.m., a second contact appeared. Northeast. 14 nautical miles. Same speed profile. Same vessel category on AIS. Foxtrot 2. At 9:58 a.m., 4 more contacts. Bearings ranging from 015 to 078 degrees, ranges between 11 and 18 nautical miles, all closing at speeds between 8 and 11 knots. Foxtrot 3 through Foxtrot 6. Their AIS identifiers showed them as vessels registered out of Sancha, the Chinese administrative city on Woody Island in the Paracels, whose establishment in 2012 was specifically designed to provide a civilian administrative framework for Chinese maritime claims in the South China Sea. 6 contacts, all from the north and northeast, all converging on the destroyer's position, all broadcasting civilian AIS identifiers, all moving with the directional coherence of a response force that had been positioned in the reef's vicinity before the destroyer arrived, and was now executing a pre-planned encirclement approach rather than reacting to the destroyer's presence from random fishing positions. The watch officer had seen this pattern in the operational briefings. He had seen the satellite imagery from previous incidents at Whitsun Reef and at Julian Philippe Reef and at Scarborough Shoal. The images that showed hundreds of militia vessels arranged in tight, geometrically precise clusters that looked, from orbit, like organized military formations rather than fishing fleets. He had read the analytical assessments that documented the vessel's equipment fit, navigation and communication systems more capable than any commercial fishing operation required, enclosed bridge structures with equipment mounting points inconsistent with fishing use, crew compositions that included personnel whose documented maritime qualifications were oriented toward seamanship rather than fishing. He reported the 6 contacts to the commanding officer at 9:58 a.m. and characterized them accurately. Probable maritime militia executing an encirclement approach on the destroyer's position. The commanding officer was on the bridge at 10:03 a.m. He He reviewed the surface plot with the assessment of someone who understood precisely what the next several hours were going to require: the legal and operational management of a situation in which a dozen or more vessels, whose civilian status precluded the weapons employment authorities that would apply to equivalent military contacts, were going to attempt to deny the destroyer freedom of movement through a combination of physical positioning, radio harassment, and the sustained application of a presence that was militarily organized but legally unchallenged. The destroyer maintained its heading. At 10:14 a.m., the contact count had grown to 11. 5 additional vessels had appeared from bearings to the east and southeast, Foxtrot 7 through Foxtrot 11, closing from ranges between 8 and 22 nautical miles. The surface plot now showed 11 contacts in an arc from bearing 340 degrees to bearing 145 degrees, all closing, all maintaining civilian AIS broadcasts, all moving with the organized coherence that distinguished this formation from random commercial traffic. The arc covered the northern half of the destroyer's azimuth. The southern half remained clear. The communications officer transmitted on bridge-to-bridge channel 16 at 10:16 a.m. The transmission identified the destroyer by type and operational status, declared its freedom of navigation transit heading, and requested all vessels in the vicinity to maintain safe navigation distances consistent with international maritime regulations. The transmission was made in English and Mandarin. It was made 4 times over the following 20 minutes. Responses came back from 3 of the 11 contacts. All 3 responded in Mandarin, identifying themselves as fishing vessels operating under Chinese Fisheries Management Authority in what they characterized as Chinese sovereign waters, and warning the destroyer that its presence was illegal and that it should immediately withdraw from the area. The transmissions used the same language that Chinese maritime militia forces have used in documented previous incidents at this and other features in the South China Sea: formulaic, legalistic, and clearly scripted rather than spontaneous, the language of operators executing a communications protocol rather than fishermen expressing genuine concern about their catch. The destroyer maintained its heading. At 10:31 a.m., the first contact crossed the 500-yard threshold. Foxtrot 1, the lead contact that had appeared first at 12 nautical miles and had been closing for 44 minutes, had drawn to within 500 yards of the destroyer's port beam and matched its speed exactly, not approaching at an angle that would bring it closer, matching speed on a parallel heading that held it at 500 yards off the port beam with the mechanical precision of a vessel whose helmsman was following a specific instruction rather than exercising the normal seamanship variations that a fishing boat maintaining relative position would produce. 500 yards. Parallel track. Exact speed match. A fishing vessel maintaining exact speed match with a naval vessel at 500 yards is not fishing. At 10:34 a.m., Foxtrot 3 took up a position 600 yards off the destroyer's starboard bow. Foxtrot 7 established itself at 480 yards off the port bow. Foxtrot 9 came up 550 yards off the starboard beam. Within 8 minutes, 4 of the 11 contacts had taken up positions that enclosed the destroyer on 4 sides: port beam, starboard bow, port bow, starboard beam, at ranges between 480 and 600 yards, all maintaining exact speed matches, all holding their positions with the steady, patient precision of a formation that had executed this procedure before and was executing it now with the confidence of familiarity. The encirclement was not violent. It was not threatening in any conventional military sense. It did not involve weapons, targeting radars, or any of the behaviors that would trigger the engagement authorities the destroyer carried. It was a geometrical argument conducted in hull positions at 480 to 600 yards, stating something specific in the language of physical presence. You are enclosed. Your freedom of movement is contingent on our cooperation, and we are not going to cooperate. The commanding officer directed no immediate change to the destroyer's heading or speed. Maintaining the planned freedom of navigation transit heading through the encirclement was itself a statement, a rejection of the argument that the encirclement was trying to make. A course deviation in response to civilian vessel positioning would confirm to the formation and to whatever shore-based authority was directing it that the tactic worked. Confirmation that the tactic works is an invitation to use it again at every subsequent transit. The commanding officer was not going to provide that confirmation. The MH-60R Seahawk, which had been on a screening orbit 15 nautical miles ahead of the destroyer since 8:40 a.m., received new tasking at 10:37 a.m. The crew descended to 200 feet and began an orbit directly above the encircling formation. Not above any single vessel, but above the formation as a whole, the helicopter's presence overhead simultaneously visible to every contact in the encirclement and transmitting continuous video to the destroyer's CIC and to 7th Fleet's Operations Center. The video feed showed the formation's geometry with the overhead clarity that 200 feet provides. 11 vessels in an organized arc, 4 of them in tight parallel track positions around the destroyer, the remaining 7 holding at various distances with the behavioral pattern of a reserve element waiting for instructions. At 10:44 a.m., Foxtrot 1 reduced its range from 500 yards to 320 yards. The closure was slow and deliberate, not the rapid closing of an aggressive approach, but the measured, incremental reduction of a vessel whose operator understood the difference between 500 yards and 320 yards in terms of the responses it would trigger, and was testing whether 320 yards produced a different response than 500. At 320 yards, with a vessel transmitting civilian AIS, making no threatening communications, exhibiting no weapons, and carrying out no action that could be characterized as a hostile act, the destroyer's engagement authorities were not satisfied. The vessel was close. It was deliberately close. And the authorities that would have applied to an IRGC fast attack craft at this range did not apply to a vessel that looked, in every documentable way, like a fishing boat. The commanding officer directed the forward deck camera to acquire Foxtrot 1 at close range and maintain continuous recording. He directed the communications officer to transmit on Channel 16 specifically to Foxtrot 1's AIS identifier, advising the vessel that it was operating at an unsafe proximity to a U.S. Navy warship and was required to increase its separation distance immediately. The transmission was made in Mandarin and English. Foxtrot 1 acknowledged the transmission and maintained its position at 320 yards. At 10:51 a.m., the Seahawk descended to 120 feet directly above Foxtrot 1. At 120 feet, the helicopter's rotor wash produced a significant sea surface disturbance directly below the aircraft, a visible, physical demonstration of presence that made the helicopter's position and its observation of the vessel below unmistakable to everyone on Foxtrot 1's deck. The crew transmitted a continuous description of everything they could observe. Deck equipment, personnel positions, antenna configurations, any equipment that deviated from the profile of a commercial fishing vessel. The observations were transmitted simultaneously to the destroyer, to 7th Fleet, and to the combined intelligence product that Pacific Fleet maintained on the Maritime Militia's vessel characteristics. At 10:54 a.m., the Electronic Warfare Suite registered active emissions from Foxtrot 1. Not radar emissions, communications emissions on frequencies associated with the PLA's Maritime Militia Coordination Network, rather than the civilian maritime channels that a commercial fishing vessel would use. The emissions were brief and encrypted, but their frequency characteristics were unambiguous to a collection system that had been specifically tasked to detect exactly this category of transmission. Foxtrot 1 was communicating on military militia frequencies, not fishing vessel frequencies, while its AIS broadcast characterized it as a commercial vessel. The electronic warfare officer logged the emission with timestamp and frequency data and transmitted the collection to Pacific Fleet Intelligence at 10:55 a.m. The collection product was significant. A vessel transmitting on PLA militia coordination frequencies while broadcasting civilian AIS is not a fishing boat. The collection documented what the visual observation could suggest, but not confirm. The legal fiction of civilian status was producing demonstrable radio frequency evidence of its own falsity in the form of military communications architecture operating underneath the civilian broadcast layer. At 11:08 a.m., 3 additional vessels, Foxtrot 12, 13, and 14, appeared on the surface plot to the north, closing from 19 nautical miles. The formation was being reinforced. The encirclement geometry was growing denser. Whatever shore-based authority was directing the operation had assessed that the initial 11 contacts had not produced the intended response and had committed its reserve element to increase the pressure. The timing of the reinforcement, 37 minutes after the initial encirclement was established and 8 minutes after Foxtrot 1's closure to 320 yards had produced no course change from the destroyer, was consistent with a command authority receiving real-time observation reports from the formation and making escalation decisions based on those reports. The 3 new contacts were not responding to opportunistic circumstances. They were being directed. The Seahawk crew overhead logged the arrival of the reinforcement element and adjusted their orbit to cover the expanded formation geometry. The video feed that Pacific Fleet's Operations Center was watching now showed 17 vessels in a compressed arc, 3 of them still closing from 19 nautical miles, 14 already in position, with the destroyer in the center of the geometry and the southern opening as the only corridor that had not been closed to less than 800 yards. The commanding officer made a decision at 11:11 a.m. that was operational rather than tactical. He altered the destroyer's heading 15 degrees to the south, not a withdrawal from the transit area. A heading change that moved the destroyer's projected track away from the denser encirclement geometry to the north and toward the less dense southern arc of the formation, where the vessel density was lower and the freedom of movement was geometrically greater. The maneuver was not a response to the encirclement's pressure in the sense of retreating from it. It was a navigation of the encirclement's geometry to find the line of least resistance while maintaining the freedom of navigation, transit's legal character. The transit continued, the heading changed within the legal corridor, and the change selected the approach that avoided the densest concentration of obstructing vessels rather than yielding the transit area entirely. The southern arc of the formation was thinner. Foxtrot 5 and Foxtrot 8 were at ranges of 800 and 950 yards to the south, significantly further than the tight 320 to 600 yard positions being held to the north and east. The destroyer transited between them at 11:19 a.m., its hull passing through the southern opening of the encirclement with 720 yards of separation on the port side and 810 yards on the starboard side. Not comfortable margins. Comfortable margins are not what freedom of navigation operations in contested South China Sea features produce. They produce the margin that exists after the geometry has been managed, which on this transit was 720 yards to port through a channel created by the deliberate selection of the approach with the least obstruction. The formation did not follow the destroyer through the southern opening with the speed or organization that would have been required to close the corridor before the transit completed. 3 vessels attempted to reposition, but the adjustment required time and course changes that the destroyer's speed through the opening had already made irrelevant. By 11:24 a.m., the destroyer was through the densest portion of the encirclement and in open water to the south, with the formation reorganizing behind it. The freedom of navigation transit was complete at 11:31 a.m. when the destroyer crossed the southern boundary of the Whitsun Reef operational area on its planned exit heading. The after-action report compiled at 1:45 p.m. was precise in its documentation and deliberate in its framing. 14 maritime militia contacts identified. Encirclement geometry established with 4 contacts at ranges between 320 and 600 yards. Military militia communications collected from Foxtrot 1 on PLA coordination frequencies, while civilian AIS was active. Seahawk overhead observation producing close-range imagery of vessel configurations. Destroyer heading adjustment of 15 degrees south to navigate through the southern arc's lower density at 11:11 a.m. Freedom of navigation transit completed on exit heading at 11:31 a.m. 0 weapons employed. 0 physical contact between any vessel. 0 deviations from the freedom of navigation transit's legal character. The intelligence product generated by the engagement was documented in a separate annex. The electronic warfare collection on Foxtrot 1's military communications frequencies was the most significant individual product, direct radio frequency evidence of military coordination operating beneath a civilian cover, collected during an active encirclement operation from a vessel whose crew was simultaneously broadcasting civilian AIS and transmitting on PLA, militia coordination channels. The Seahawk's video documentation of the encirclement's geometry, 14 vessels in an organized, precise formation, maintaining exact speed matches, was a visual intelligence product whose value was in its completeness rather than any single detail. The full picture, assembled from 3 sensor inputs simultaneously, was more than the sum of its parts. The legal and strategic significance of the encounter extended beyond the tactical outcome. The freedom of navigation transit had been completed. The maritime militia's encirclement had not prevented it. But the encirclement had established a pattern, a documented, sensor-recorded, radio-frequency evidenced pattern of civilian-registered vessels executing military-coordinated encirclement operations under orders from a command authority that their communications architecture made real and traceable even when their AIS broadcasts tried to make it invisible. The pattern exists in the record. The transit happened. The encirclement did not prevent it. And the evidence that the encirclement was a military operation dressed in civilian AIS is now part of the intelligence product that the next transit will carry in its briefing package, alongside the tactical procedures that were refined by what the commanding officer decided at 11:11 a.m. when he read the geometry and found the opening in the south. 14 contacts, 94 minutes from first appearance to transit completion. 4 vessels at ranges inside 600 yards simultaneously. 1 PLA militia communications collection from a vessel broadcasting civilian AIS. 1 Seahawk overhead documentation package. 1 15-degree heading adjustment that navigated the geometry rather than yielding to it. 0 weapons. 0 physical contact. 1 transit completed. The South China Sea belongs to the evidence that is generated in it, and the transits that happen in it, despite the formations that try to make them not happen. The transit happened. The evidence was generated. The record will be read by everyone who needs to understand what freedom of navigation costs in this waterway when it is contested by 14 hulls and a legal fiction that the radio frequencies cannot sustain.